There used to be a lot of walkways that Christy built, went all around. We still have some remnant pieces from his gardens, the lilacs, which are above, behind you on the chairs, the pear trees, a big ginkgo tree. These are all from the Christy era. So we have a little bit left over, but this barn is really the quintessential building that we have. This is a 100-year centennial, so we decided to have this event. We're really thrilled to have so many people. I expected maybe we'd have 50. We've been turning people away for this thing tonight. So I'd like to tell you a lot about the Barracks, but just grab onto me on the side or drive up the driveway some evening. I can show you a lot of pictures and talk to you a lot. I'd like to have my wife come and tell you a little bit about her collection and introduce our speaker tonight and get things going on for
Welcome to you. It's been a really great evening for us. We're so glad that you all took this evening out of your summer to join us. And we know that many of you have special interests in Howard Chandler Christy, as do we. And since we had this history in Jay's family, I started collecting much of the memorabilia you saw upstairs today. So it's been a fun little hobby for me, and I've probably bid against some of you on eBay for these items. So I did recognize actually a couple of your names from that, so that was kind of fun. You probably noticed on your program that our speaker tonight was to be Elaine Stomber from Lafayette College, and she unfortunately had a death in her family, so was unable to come. And she was really disappointed that she couldn't make the trip because she, put a lot of effort in planning for her visit and was very disappointed. But we totally understand. Family always comes first. And I imposed on another one of our guests, Jim Head, which many of you also know Jim. And he is from Virginia and is writing a book about Howard Chandler Christy right now. And he graciously accommodated us tonight. And I think you'll find that he's probably the foremost expert on Mr. Christy, and we're really pleased to have him talk to us tonight. Thanks, Jim.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here tonight. First of all, I'd like to thank our gracious hosts, Jay and Melody Hayes, for putting this together. It's simply amazing, and they've done a wonderful job. Well, isn't this a beautiful place? I've never been here before, but yet I feel like I have been here before, because I've written about it. In 1914, Howard Chandler Christy wrote to author Paul Eldridge and said this about his home. It is said that this place is the most beautiful place in all of Ohio and has the most beautiful view. And I think if the trees were pushed back a bit, I think you would agree, too, that it's simply beautiful. So that's where I want to go tonight. I want to take you back 100 years to 1909, June 27th. If you were lucky enough to be invited to the house of Howard Chandler Christy, perhaps the second most popular artist in the United States, what would you see? What would you do? What would you hear? Now, at that time, in 1909, I would say the foremost artist is Charles Dana Gibson. Why? Because he'd been doing it longer than anyone else. That is illustration, at least the high end of illustration. But see, Gibson retired years earlier. Due to the stock market crash in 1907, he came back again. He had to. It sounds familiar, right? He had to go back to work. So Mr. Christy, in my opinion, would have been number 2 in the nation. And if you're invited to his house, it would have been a very special event, a very memorable event. And this is what would happen. First of all, how would you get here? Well, if you came from out of town, you'd be taking the train to Zanesville. And then one of 2 ways you can get here. You could take a steamboat down the Muskegon, and there are generally at least 2 steamboats that would go down the Muskegon from Zanesville and stop in Duncan Falls. One is the Lorena, and one is the Valley Gem. And from there, Mr. Christy would have an automobile waiting for you, and a chauffeur would pick you up and take you down here. Now, if there are many guests, he would send a horse and a hay wagon and pick you up and take you back here. And the way you would come in, you'd come up the incline of the drive, as you did this evening, but instead of going left, you would go right, and you'd come around here past the spring house, and then go on down here, and there would be a circular drive. And the first thing you'd see is this huge palatial mansion, a big barracks of a place. In fact, that's what he called it, the Barracks. And the reason he called it the Barracks was because of his fondness for the Spanish-American War. And what you'd notice in the Barracks, probably first and foremost, aside from its size, are the two massive chimneys that seem to jet up and tower over the entire place. And between the two chimneys, there's a lookout, or belvedere, which one could go up and see the Muskegon River and see the boats going up and down the Muskegon River each and every day. And if that didn't knock your socks off, all you'd have to do is look around, because there would be a long pergola and a grape arbor that would extend out close to 100 feet. And then right here to the north, you would see the old farmhouse. That was his home many years before. Farmhouse that was built in the 1850s. Now likely, as soon as you arrived, Mr. Christy may greet you. And what you'd see is a man standing about 5'8", with reddish brown hair, piercing blue eyes, medium build, very handsome, wearing something very similar to what I'm wearing. He loved white pants, white duck pants, white buckskins, and the blue blazer. And he'd come right out, cross the lawn, and with him would be this hulking, massive dog, looked like a small horse. That was his Great Dane, and his name was Sergeant. And you can guess who he named his dog after. His favorite portrait painter, John Singer Sargent. Nipping at his heels would be his other dog, an English Bull Terrier. And his name was Bill, black and white spots. And he'd come up to you and greet you personally. And then, if it's before dinner, he might invite you to play a game of croquet right here on the lawn. And perhaps if one of those stern-wheelers, such as the Valley Gem, would pass down the Muskegon, he might shoot off a cannon in honor of the captains of those stern-wheelers. It took him back to his boyhood days. And in return, the captain would then sound the calliope on the stern-wheeler. And it would send up a large musical medley of notes that would reverberate from the bluffs between the Muskegon River. Well, dinner time begins. And at that time, you'll meet Howard Chandler Christy's father, Francis Marion Christy. Civil War veteran, slightly hard of hearing, tall, lean, and gaunt. If you looked at him today, you'd probably think he looked a bit like Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. His wife, just a slip of a woman, saying about 5'1", or 5 feet perhaps, depending upon the era, is Mary Matilda Bone Christy. You probably meet the two sisters, Rose and Hope, his younger sisters. One person that you wouldn't meet, though, is Natalie Christy, his 10-year-old daughter, with brown hair. She's in New York with her mother, Maybelle. But again, this is June 27th, 1909. Wait 6 more days, July 3rd, 1909, and she will be here. In fact, she'll be here to stay. As a result, 5 months later, what will happen is perhaps the largest, most highly publicized child custody case Ohio, if not America, has ever seen, because Howard Chandler Christy wanted to keep Natalie here, and Maybelle, his first wife, wanted her back. But let's get back to the evening. You have dinner. Afterwards, you come back out. There's a flagpole in the center of the lawn. The flag would be lowered, and in return, he would hoist up a lantern. And it's said that the lantern could be seen for miles around. In fact, on one occasion in 1908, there was a group of canoemen who were lost on the Muskegon, and what saved them was that lantern. And the canoemen came up the backside of the bluff. Now we're 200 feet up over the Muskegon River, and apparently at one point there was a trail, and they climbed up the trail, and there was Christy, along with his family, and he invited him to stay for dinner. So after dinner, what you probably will do is talk, and Mr. Christy would probably light a cigar, and after that, if you're lucky, he might shoot off some rockets, and yes, detonate some dynamite. On the bluff over there, it's been said that there are stumps of trees and dead wood that were decimated by his pyrotechnics. Quite a character he was. But then again, he could get away with it. Well, you probably wouldn't stay for just one night. You'd probably be here for an entire week. And during that entire week, you'd play tennis at the tennis court over here. You'd go swimming. You might go boating. Mr. Christy, by 1909, had a boat that, well, this is kind of an interesting story. He had the engine before he actually got the boat. A certain Mr. Colonel Foster gave him an engine, and with that, he built the boat and had it up and running, and by 1909, 1910, he was zipping up and down the Muskegon River on that boat. He also went horseback riding and shooting. And it's also said that on some occasions, he would swim across the river to Philo, naked. Quite an interesting character, but that's Mr. Christy, and people oftentimes ask me, Jim, how did you become interested in Mr. Christy? And it goes back to when I was in college. Years 1988, I was a freshman at the University of Maryland studying economics. And I was up in the stacks of Hornbeck Library, and I was just absolutely bored out of my mind. So I was looking around, and I noticed up on a shelf, I spot gold. Yes, gold. Gold leaf on the edging of a big folio. So I go up, and I pull down that folio, and I look at it. It's entitled The Social Ladder by Charles Dana Gibson. And I was just stared at the illustration on the front of it, pen and ink. And I thought, this is great art. What else is inside this book? So I started reading some more and just admiring each and every illustration. There were men and women in dresses and suits that I had not seen from an era that has been bygone, 1890s, turn of the century. It was an era of opera boxes and drawing rooms. And I was just enamored with it all. And what I did that evening was I copied, yes, I Xeroxed each and every page from that folio. And the next morning I went back and I grabbed another folio and copied that too. And I copied and I copied and I copied, and I thought, this is great art. Why has this been lost? For years I've been told that Pablo Picasso is the greatest artist that ever lived. Henri Matisse, Edvard Munch, Georgia O'Keeffe. But what about Charles Dana Gibson? Well, 2 years would pass. It's 1991, and I'm in a bookstore in my hometown of Rockville, Maryland. And I see out of the corner of my eye, in the lower shelf, a book entitled America's Greatest Illustrators. It's a book by Susan Meyer. It was published in 1978 and republished again in 1987. And this was on the discount book table. And I thought, well, for $5, this is a great book. It's got 13 different illustrators in there, summaries of their lives, as well as photographs of a lot of their great work. There's J.C. Leyendecker, Frederick Remington, Howard Pyle, James Montgomery Flagg, Charles Dana Gibson, of course, John Held Jr., and of course, the great Norman Rockwell. But what interested me most was actually none of them. It was a man by the name of Howard Chandler Christy. And at that age, I was 21 then, I read through the story, and it's about 15 pages of his life. And I thought to myself, if this story is true, if it is true, as it's recounted in this book, then it's one of the greatest stories I've ever ventured upon. One of these days, I want to write a book about this man, because this is just a great story. But then I realized I'm still in college. I got to get a job. I can't write a book. So another 10 years actually more than that, would pass. And then I thought about it again. I'm going to write a book. But at that point, there weren't any resources. Now, mind you, there are thousands of pages in newspaper articles about Howard Chandler Christy, but yet there's not one biography on his life. But there wasn't an archive until around 2000. And that is a miracle story in and of itself as to how the archive of Howard Chandler Christy's papers came to be, which are now at Lafayette College in the Skillman Library in Easton, Pennsylvania. And I'll tell you about that some other day. Well, let's get back to Mr. Christy. So in 2000, once this archive made its way to Lafayette College, I made a copy of the inventory of everything that was there. And I thought, one of these days I'm going to write a book. And what did I do? I procrastinated. It wasn't until 2006 that I actually saw Howard Chandler Christy papers. And I was amazed at all the people that he knew. Presidents, from Teddy Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, Harry Truman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to generals, General Douglas MacArthur, World War heroes like Eddie Rickenbacker, living legends like Amelia Earhart, movie stars, Constance Talmadge, Norma Talmadge, Marion Davies, socialites, William Randolph Hearst, publisher. And I thought to myself, the story is true. And that, in 2006, I began writing a book. It wasn't an easy endeavor because I practiced law during the day. I'm a trust and estates lawyer, and I do trust and estate litigation. But what fascinated me about his life, aside from the story itself, was also the people that he met and how he interacted with those people. And I can tell you now, I'm halfway done with the book. It'll take another 2-3 years to finish. But I will tell you this. This is what I've discovered in my research. The most celebrated artist during the Jazz Age wasn't Pablo Picasso, wasn't Edvard Munch, wasn't George O'Keeffe, Edward Hopper, no. The great Norman Rockwell, no. It was a once blind illustrator turned portrait painter who until his dying day was known as the barefoot boy of the Blue Muskegon. In 1938, Time magazine proclaimed him the most successful commercial artist in America. And that man is Howard Chandler Christy. And here is a summary of his life. He was born January 10th, 1872, in Morgan County, in a log cabin along Meeks Creek. Age of 3, he comes here. At that time, this place was known as Christy's Knob, and he lives with his parents in the farmhouse. He sits up on a bluff right over there with his dog Turk, and he watches these steamships go by, up and down every single day. And he has dreams of going off to the big city and doing big things and painting big pictures. Eventually he does that. He's not very good in school. He spends his days daydreaming, looking out the window while the teacher is trying to teach him. And instead draws on his textbooks and just doesn't really pay much attention to the teacher, and the teacher knows that too. So his education stops at age 12, goes back, works on the farm. But in 1890, he's determined to make it big, to go off and paint big pictures of big things in big cities. And he ventures to New York City during the Gilded Age. He studies art for a little while, runs out of money, comes home again. He needs more money to go back. And the second time, he does it right. He has more money, he's saved some up, and he gets a loan from his aunt. So by 1892, he's back in New York. He's studying at the Art Students League under the tutelage of William Merritt Chase, the premier portrait painter at the time. And in 2 years, he becomes Chase's premier student. It doesn't get any better than that when William Merritt Chase says, "You're my star pupil." After that, Christy decides, well, he could go into portrait painting, but he'll make more money doing illustration, drawing pretty pictures that are printed in magazines. Now, I should back up a bit, because nowadays that seems somewhat foreign to us. Why would you buy a magazine for the illustrations, for the pictures? But back then, there weren't any radios, there weren't any televisions, there weren't any movies, and all you had were newspapers and magazines. And people bought them because of the beautiful pictures. They wanted beauty in their life. And so he became an illustrator, much to the dismay of William Merritt Chase. In fact, it's said that William Merritt Chase didn't speak to him for 3 years after that. And he started with Century magazine and then continued on with other magazines. But it's now 1898, February. The ship, the Maine, blows up in Havana Harbor, and the Spanish-American War breaks out. Well, he likes the excitement of it all, and he decides he wants to get involved in the Spanish-American War, not as a soldier, but as a painter. He wants to cover it for Leslie's Weekly and Scribner's Magazine, and he does just that. With a $2 camera and a couple of $20 gold pieces, he hops on a train, goes down to Florida, and ends up in the Tampa Bay Hotel, where the U.S. soldiers are camping out. The officers, of course, are staying in the hotel, like Teddy Roosevelt. He befriends Teddy Roosevelt, and next thing you know, he's headed over to Cuba on board the Yucatan with the Rough Riders. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is how he becomes a success. He covers that war, he covers the horror of warfare, he covers the battles, and he's even so good at covering it with pen and ink and watercolor that they allow him to write a few things. And he publishes at least 6 different articles in Leslie's Weekly about his time in the Spanish-American War. And after it's all over, he comes back. And the public adore him. They love him. For weeks, they've been seeing these centerfolds in Leslie's Weekly and Scribner's, and they just are beside themselves because he's so good at what he does. Well, at the same point in time, Christy falls in love. He falls in love with a society debutante by the name of Maybelle. She was born in Washington, D.C., and she was up in New York with her mother. And the love affair is quite quick. In fact, they get married within months. As you can imagine, it turns out to be a train wreck. But what it does do is it precipitates his love affair of beauty. And because of it, he creates something new called the Christy Girl. He decides he doesn't want to paint the horrors of warfare anymore. He doesn't really want to paint men. He wants to paint beauty. So he creates this amalgam, a modern paradigm of feminine beauty that represents womanhood at its finest. Virtue, intelligence, she's athletic. She has everything going for herself. And with that, from a celebrity, he becomes a superstar. Everyone wants more of the Christy Girl. There are Christy Girl calendars, there are Christy Girl books, there are Christy Girl postcards, there are Christy Girl dresses, there are Christy Girl hats, shoes. There's even Christy Girl cigars. There's even Howard Chandler Christy cigars. 2 for 5 cents. So with that, he becomes the most celebrated artist, I would say, at that time period in 1909. Now, he was living in New York, and you may ask, well, why did he decide to come back here? Because he did in 1908. Well, he was having some difficulties with his wife, some family troubles. He was also becoming an alcoholic. The deadline pressures of cranking out illustration after illustration were harrowing. At the same time, his wife, Maybelle, just wanted to have family and friends over. So you can only imagine being an artist, whether you're a painter or a writer or a musician, having people swirling about your house while you're pressed on a tight deadline schedule. So he decides he can't take it anymore. Of course, the alcoholism catches up to him. He loses his eyesight, mind you. Loses it for 6 months. In fact, it's highly publicized that he may go blind or may even die because of his eyesight. But he gains it all back. And he attributes that to God. With that, he decides he needs to get out of town. He can't take the city anymore. He's heading back to Ohio to go back to his roots. And so in 1908, he returns and builds his huge mansion over the river. He also wants his daughter to stay, but it's difficult dealing with his wife, so there's a trade-off. So it's not until 1909 that we have the big child custody battle. Well, there's a lot to tell you about that child custody battle because it all comes out. But let's say this. At the end of the day, he obtains custody of his daughter, Natalie, and she stays here with the family under the custody of his custody, but she must be supervised by his daughter, Rose. Christy continues to stay here until 1915. He ventures to New York from time to time. And on one such occasion, it was 1912. That's the same year the Titanic sank. It was around April of 1912, in fact, that he was in New York. And a certain young woman by the name of Nancy Palmer, who worked in a cigar factory up in Poughkeepsie, wanted to do something different than stripping brittle leaves off cigar stems. So she somehow obtains a letter of introduction to Charles Dana Gibson. Charles Dana Gibson meets her, and he realizes that he doesn't have any use for her. He has all the models that he can want, but he knew of somebody that really needed her, and that was Howard Chandler Christy. Now, why, you may ask, did Christy need a model in 1912? Well, because the child custody suit was so highly publicized, no young woman of that age, and at that point, Nancy was 19 years of age, no young woman would come here alone and stay with a man to be painted in illustration. So Gibson knew this, and Gibson introduced Nancy Palmer to Howard Chandler Christy. And to them, it was, I wouldn't say immediately love at first sight, but she was enamored, in fact nervous, and he was enamored too. And he takes Nancy back here to the Barracks in 1912, and she becomes his premier model. So a lot of the illustrations you'll see from 1912 until about 1919 have Nancy's face in the illustration. Well, in 1915, he decides he's going to head back to New York, and he does just that. He goes back to New York with Nancy, buys a duplex studio apartment on 1 West 67th Street in a place called the Hotel des Artistes. And it's not a hotel, it's a cooperative apartment. And at the time, this is kind of interesting, to buy this apartment in 1915, it was only $15,900 to buy this studio apartment with 2 bedrooms. So he moves in there, Nancy's across the street, the Marie Antoinette, and he just continues on painting and painting and painting. Eventually, in 1919, he divorces his first wife. And I suspect, I certainly don't have any evidence to the contrary, that was really his second wife, or his first wife rather, Maybelle, that wanted to divorce him. Because as soon as the divorce papers were filed here in Muskegon County, which is kind of interesting from a legal perspective because they're both living in New York, yet the divorce is filed here. As soon as they're filed, she defaults. She doesn't do anything, in other words. She doesn't answer. They get the divorce, and 30 days later, she remarries. It takes him a few months before he remarries. And he marries his model, Nancy Palmer. She becomes Nancy Palmer Christy. Well, it's now 1919, and I guess I probably should have prefaced this by saying there was a world war that broke out. Of course, America wasn't involved until 1917. But Christy was involved in that World War because he produced quite a few posters, World War I posters, that compelled thousands of men to go off and fight during the wars. Now, some of those posters have Nancy's face on them. Others have other models' faces, such as Consuelo Flowerton and Bernice Tongate Smith. But in any event, those posters were instrumental in compelling thousands of men to become involved in a war that no one really wanted. America was neutral, and it became involved in the war, and we had to all of a sudden escalate and build up armaments and, of course, build up an army. And those types of posters, and you'll see quite a few of them here, pushed men to join the armed forces. And unlike the other poster illustrators, Christy used women because he knew women would force men to join the Army. In fact, he would dress women in military uniforms, sort of a sexual gender bender type of ploy to entice men to become involved in their country. And of course, it was extremely successful. Some illustrators, such as James Montgomery Flagg, say that the war would not have been won had it not been for Christy. So now we're up to 1921. At this point, Nancy's been married for a couple years. She's getting older in looks. She's moving on. And she realizes that perhaps it isn't such a great thing that her husband have all these young models come parading in the studio apartment. And with that, she persuades Christy to go into portrait painting. And that he does, and is a huge success in portrait painting. Initially, he paints Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, I mean, big people of the day. And of course, paints even more people. Eventually, Benito Mussolini in 1927, William Randolph Hearst, and many others. So the 20s were a great decade for him. He made a lot of money. Oftentimes he would sell his paintings for about $15,000 or $20,000. Again, this is the 1920s, a huge sum of money. And people paid for those paintings. Then the 1930s come around, and there's a depression. And he was once selling paintings for 15, 20 grand. Now it's 3 grand, 4 grand, if he can get even that. And he turns to the government, because the government needs him to paint paintings of people in Congress. And he does just that. He paints the painting of, or the portrait rather, of William Bankhead, Speaker of the House, John Nance Garner, Vice President, Congressman Saul Bloom, Eleanor Norris Rogers, Henry Stegall, and a few others. Today, there are 7 paintings of Howard Chandler Christy in the U.S. Capitol. 6 portraits, and of course, the largest painting in the U.S. Capitol, the 20 by 30 feet, signing the U.S. Constitution, which he did in 1939, finished in 1940. In the White House, there are 2 paintings by Christy. There's the painting of Grace Goodhue Coolidge, the wife of Calvin Coolidge, that makes up the China Room. In fact, they designed the China Room around that portrait, and a posthumous portrait of Rachel Jackson. Now, Christy, during the Depression, had difficulty making money. So he did what he liked doing best, which is painting nudes. And he did quite a few of them. He painted 33 nudes for the Park Lane Hotel, and in 1934 started painting nudes for the Café des Artistes, which was the restaurant below where he lived on 1 West 67th Street. By 1937, Congressman Saul Bloom, again, Christy painted his portrait, asked him if he would be so kind as to paint a scene of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the reason was there was not an accurate painting at that time of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And it was 1937. It was the sesquicentennial of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. So he did that. He painted an allegory of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And it was very popular during the time. They made many posters of that painting. In fact, if you go up here in the studio, you'll see one of those posters, that allegory. Well, it got Saul Bloom thinking. And he thought, well, there ought to be a painting of the signing of the U.S. Constitution in the Capitol. But there wasn't. So he persuaded his friends that that's what they need to do. So he tried to push through a bill that would name Christy as being the artist to paint the signing of the Constitution, and Christy would get $35,000 to paint the signing of the Constitution. Some congressmen didn't like it. It was in the midst of the Great Depression, and they're paying an artist, what, $35,000 for a painting when people don't even have bread on their table? So, with several other congressmen, they came up with a proposal. And this is what it was. There'd be a committee of 3 people, the Speaker of the House, the Vice President of the United States, and the Architect of the Capitol, who would select a painter who would receive $30,000 to paint a scene of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Well, guess who the artist was that was selected? It was Howard Chandler Christy. How could that be? Well, Christy painted John Nance Garner, the Vice President of the United States. He had painted William Bankhead, Speaker of the House. The only person he didn't paint was the architect of the Capitol. But the architect of the Capitol was a good friend of his. So he won that battle. And he got $30,000 out of it. Well, he went right to work in September of 1939 on that painting. In fact, it said that in the first day he was able to sketch out all the signers. Now, this is a man who's 68 years of age. And the canvas is huge, 20 by 30 feet, the largest painting in the Capitol, and in fact, when it was unveiled in 1940, the largest painting in the United States. So it's simply amazing that a man of that age would have that kind of vitality to do a painting of that size. But he did it, and he finished it in January of 1940. And the U.S. Capitol will tell you that he finished it in April 1940, but I've got correspondence that is very clear that he had finished that, and he was doing the portrait of Marjorie Merriweather Post's husband at that point, Joseph Davies, Ambassador Joseph Davies. So he did that very quickly, and of course it was unveiled in the U.S. Capitol to much applause before congressmen and senators. Unfortunately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't able to make that, that event. But it was perhaps one of the biggest celebrations the Capitol's ever seen, and it was really humbling to him. Because here is a man that was the son of a Civil War veteran who grew up on a farm, who only has an education of a 12-year-old. And yet, he did achieve his dream. He painted a big picture, and it was in the U.S. Capitol. Well, Mr. Christy continued painting many more paintings and portraits than I can even tell you tonight. We'll run out of time. But what I wanted to do is this. I wanted to tell you a little bit about his last days, because that really intrigued me. You know, in 1947, there was a sesquicentennial for Zanesville, and he came for that. And that was the last time he was here, and he saw the house, the barracks. It was much different than what he had seen back in 1912 or 1909. It looked much different. The chimneys were truncated, they were cut off, the belvedere was gone, the glass panels on the south portico were gone, it had wisteria growing up on the front of it. And I can only imagine what he thought, having gone through what he's gone through, and all the big, powerful people he's painted. But it must have been a humbling experience. He did return to Ohio in 1951, but never back here again. And in 1952, he died on March 3rd at 5 minutes after 12. Nancy Christy wasn't in the apartment at that point. She went out to run an errand and returned, and when she returned, her husband was dead of a heart attack. In the following days, it was reported that he was there signing checks at his desk, and he fell over from a heart attack. But that isn't the true story. See, Nancy Christy went to the grave with the secret that she didn't want anyone to know. But it's a good secret. And it really is the most powerful part of Christy's story. In the days following his death, from New York to New Mexico, South Carolina to Iowa, Christie's passing quickly made front page news. He was just big, from a publicity standpoint, he was just about as big dead as he was alive. And this is what was said. The New York Times. He was an artist of tireless energy, a veritable journalist of the easel and brush. The New York Herald Tribune said this: if popularity is a hallmark of artistic success and thousands have striven for it in all eras, Mr. Christy was one of the most successful of all artists, for his illustrations appeared in scores of periodicals and books. His portraits were eagerly sought after, and his famous painting of the signing of the Constitution still is an object of admiration in the Capitol. Medals came to him in profusion, as did friendships, and he had a substantial influence as a teacher. Perhaps his greatest achievement was in winning acclaim both as a popular illustrator and as a serious painter. It is for posterity to determine in which field he will be remembered longer. But certainly in his own lifetime, he found renown and satisfaction in both. One newspaper from Zanesville, Ohio, called him this: the Ohio artist whose magic brush captured the pageant of American history. Another Zanesville newspaper imparted this message: From a barefoot boy, Mr. Christy rose to be one of the world's most famous artists. An editorial from Helena, Montana said this: they unequivocally declared his art seldom equaled, and further emphasized that he'd become a veritable institution well before his death because he influenced and reflected the customs and tastes of the changing decades. To me, perhaps the most poignant of all commentaries on Christie's life was a brief editorial printed in the evening edition of a small-town Maryland newspaper. It said this: if it were given to all men to see with the eyes of Howard Chandler Christy, and to depict with his hand what had been seen, there could be a wealth of beauty now denied to those who see distortion and ugliness and reflect nothing more. 3 days after his death, Christy was interred in Westchester County at Ferncliff Cemetery. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Howard Chandler Christy is not a story about an artist and his art. It's a story about the changing of America through the first half of the 20th century and the man that helped influence it and capture it. It's a rags to riches epic of an ordinary man. Yes, that's right, an ordinary man, because that's how he perceived himself. A common man, living in remarkable times, but possessing an extraordinary talent, the power to seize beauty and immortalize youth on canvas. Christy had fortune and fame and beautiful models, but in the end of it, he discovered something much greater than that. And before I leave you, I want to tell you this. Several days after his death, on a Sunday, a minister of a small church in Zanesville gave a short eulogy. He had never met Mr. Christy or even seen him in person, but he had this to say about him. Again and again, we read in our newspapers glowing accounts of hometown boys made good in the metropolitan areas of our country. By sheer persistency of effort and a strong and unbreakable faith in their purpose and goals, they won the acclaim of many in high places. So there went forth from Muskegon County a young man by the name of Howard Chandler Christy, who as a boy walked the same streets as you and I do each day of our lives. A log cabin not too far from here and a beautiful oil painting in the halls of Congress. This is the story in but a few words of the creative genius of a small-town boy whose name was Christy. And so I quote the immortal words of Abe Lincoln: "It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. As long as appreciation of beauty and art abides in human hearts, so long will the name of Howard Chandler Christy live on, the name of a small-town boy who lived near Zanesville." Thank you.